the man who signed off on one of the most consequential executions in history, tried to wash his hands of it. That's the image most people remember. A reluctant governor, a hesitant judge, a man pressured into a decision he didn't want to make. But here's the question. Was Pontius Pilate actually reluctant, or was that story rewritten to make him look that way? Because when you step outside the familiar narrative and look at what history actually says, a very different figure starts to emerge. Let's start with the setting. Roman Judea, a province on edge, religious tension, political instability, constant risk of rebellion, and in the middle of it, a Roman prefect tasked with one job: keep order at all costs. That's Pilate's role. Not priest, not philosopher, not moral referee, administrator, enforcer. So here's the first question you need to ask. What does Rome expect from a man in Pilate's position? Not fairness, not spiritual insight. Results. If the province stays quiet, he keeps his post. If it erupts, he's replaced, or worse. Now, bring in the figure at the center of the trial, a man gathering followers, speaking about a kingdom, drawing crowds, in a region already sensitive to messianic movements. So ask yourself, from Rome's perspective, what does that look like? A teacher or a potential threat? Because Rome didn't wait for revolutions to happen. They prevented them, early, decisively, publicly. Now let's compare the familiar story with external accounts. The Gospels present Pilate as hesitant, questioning, almost trying to avoid the execution. But when we look at sources like Tacitus, the tone shifts. Tacitus doesn't describe a conflicted judge. He states it plainly. Christ was executed under Pilate. No hesitation, no drama, just a recorded fact. So now the question becomes, why does one account emphasize reluctance, while another presents simple authority? Because those differences matter. They shape how we understand the event, and more importantly, how we understand responsibility. Let's talk about the trial itself. Because legally, this wasn't a religious proceeding. It was a Roman one. And Roman law had a clear priority: maintain public order, not theological accuracy, not doctrinal debate, stability. So what charge would matter to Rome? Not blasphemy, that internal to Jewish law. What matters to Rome is something else. A claim to kingship, king of the Jews. That title changes everything. Because now we're not talking about religion. We're talking about politics, authority, power. So ask yourself, if someone is accused of claiming kingship in a Roman province, how does Rome respond? Carefully or decisively? History gives us the answer. Rome responds with force. Because allowing even the idea of rival authority to grow is a risk they don't take. Now look at Pilate again, a man responsible for preventing unrest, facing a situation where crowds are gathering, leaders are agitated, tension is rising. So the real question isn't, did Pilate want to execute? It's, did Pilate see any alternative that kept the peace? Because from a Roman administrative standpoint, execution isn't failure, it's control. Now, let's address the famous moment. Pilate washing his hands, symbolically removing responsibility. But here's the problem. That gesture isn't Roman. It's not part of Roman legal practice. It's a cultural detail that reflects something else. So why include it? Because it shifts the narrative. It reframes Pilate as reluctant. It redistributes blame. And that leads to a harder question. Was this detail added to explain the event or to reshape how it was remembered? Now, consider the political environment when the Gospels were written. Decades after the event, in a world where the Roman Empire still holds power. So ask yourself, would early writers present Rome as directly responsible or soften that image? Because that decision has consequences. Now let's go deeper. Roman trials, especially in provinces, weren't always formal. They could be quick, practical, driven by circumstance rather than procedure. So the idea of a long, detailed legal debate, that may not reflect reality. Instead, what we might be looking at is something far simpler, an administrative decision, a judgment call, made under pressure, with one priority: prevent escalation. And that brings us back to Pilate's character, because outside of the Gospels, he doesn't appear gentle or hesitant. Historical accounts describe him as firm, sometimes harsh, willing to use force when needed. So now we have two images, the reluctant judge and the pragmatic governor. So which one aligns with the system he served? Because Rome didn't appoint men who hesitated. They appointed men who acted. Now, let's return to the core question. Was this a miscarriage of justice or a calculated decision within a political system? Because those are not the same thing. One implies error. The other implies intention. And if it was intentional, then the execution was an accident. It was a message, public, visible, unambiguous. That's how Rome maintained control, not just through law, but through demonstration. So what does that mean for how we understand this moment? It means stepping outside the familiar narrative and asking harder questions about power, about authority, about how history is written. Because history isn't just what happened. It's how events are recorded, interpreted, framed, and when multiple accounts exist, the differences between them matter. So here's the final question. Was Pontius Pilate a man caught in a moral dilemma, or a Roman official doing exactly what his position required? Because the answer changes everything, not just about the trial, but about how we understand the system behind it. If this made you rethink what you've always heard, subscribe, because the next question goes even deeper. If history can reshape responsibility, what else has been reframed without us noticing?